Mitigating the carbon pollution problem is one of the most important issues facing the oil and gas industry today. But what does sustainable oil and gas really look like? There's certainly technical issues around how oil and gas are extracted, transported, and refined, as well as carbon capture, sustainable aviation fuels, and next-generation plastics. There's also the question of how capital intersects with the industry and its future. I'm Doug Heintzman. I'm the Chief Catalyst at the Blockchain Research Institute. Welcome to W3B Talks, an ongoing exploration of the impact of Web3 and blockchain technologies on business, government, and society. And in this episode, we're going to look at sustainable oil and gas. And who better to help us navigate this topic than Si Chen? Si is the co-author of Sustainable Oil and Gas Using Blockchain. Si is also the president of Open Source Strategies, an open source developer, and formerly an investment fund manager. He also leads the development of open source blockchain carbon accounting software in the Hyperledger ecosystem, specifically with the climate accounting and certifications and energy working groups. Welcome to the podcast, Si. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. This is a topic that I'm personally very interested in. I've done a lot of research in the oil and gas industry, and I actually sit on the board of advisors for Blockchain for Energy and work a lot with major oil companies. So when I saw your book and had a chance to talk with you, I knew we had to have you on to kind of explore this topic in a little more detail. And so there seems to be at least in my mind, for the longest time, until I started doing a lot of research, there was a bit of a contradictory, kind of a cognitive dissonance that I was always struggling with. The idea of sustainability and oil and gas in the same sentence always, kind of struck me as a bit of a non-starter, that the real answer was to basically get out of oil and gas as quickly as possible and move into sustainables. And we should put all of our effort into making sustainable energy sources, much more, realistic and much more economical and actually get to implementing them. But I've come to appreciate that that's a somewhat naive point of view. At least there's a lot more nuance involved. So can you help us understand what sustainable oil and gas really means?
Sure. In the context of our book, which talked a lot about the initiatives in the oil and gas industry for addressing the climate problem, like the ones you mentioned, carbon capture, sustainable bioaviation fuels and plastics and things like that. There's a lot of technologies that the oil and gas industry can do to reduce or even completely remove the climate impact of their products and output. So a sustainable oil and gas industry for us, on one hand, is a environmentally sustainable industry, one that's not causing the climate change and the environmental harm that is happening right now. And on the other hand, it's more sustainable from a business and financial point of view, so that it delivers more consistent returns to investors and is an ongoing and successful business like many other industries are today.
Yeah, well, this kind of gets to a bit of my cognitive dissonance because, there's you think of the analog of the tobacco industry and, doing things to make the industry make sense for investors seems to be, a contraindication, that you seem to be going in the wrong direction, that this shouldn't be something that we make affordable and profitable, because if we do, then we just make the era of oil and gas last longer than it probably should. And ultimately, that's going to be a really, really big problem. So how do I kind of, tie that off?
Okay. Yeah. People do make that analogy, but for me, the disconnect is obviously I don't smoke, and I think of that as a choice that people have made. Probably a bad one in my opinion, but it's not something that everybody has to do. But we live in a world that is completely made by oil and gas, right? You can't go through a day without touching something that's wrapped in plastic, made from plastic, drive on a road that's paved with tar and with a car that's powered by gasoline or electricity powered by natural gas. So oil and gas is much more pervasive, and it's basically what the whole world is built with. And on the other hand, there are technologies, at least we believe now, that will successfully negate the climate impact of using oil and gas, from things like carbon capture to reducing the production emissions of all these products. So yes, we absolutely need to increase renewable energy and other forms of energy investments. But at the same time, there is a path for an oil and gas industry that is, we believe, environmentally sustainable and sustainable as businesses. And it's important that we help the oil and gas industry get there, because the worst thing that could happen actually is for this huge industry to basically split off on its own. Okay, and this is a scenario that could happen where the economy literally divides into two economies, the so-called green economy and the so-called brown economy, and they don't work together anymore or even talk to each other. And the whole point of a successful energy transition is to not let that happen. That's why there is this energy transition, right? We're going from the current energy system to one that is sustainable, and that includes everybody, including the oil and gas industry.
Okay, so I'm hearing kind of two things from you. One is that there's what you might think of as a harsh reality, and that is that we have an energy-intensive economy that people will freeze or not have food if we don't use energy. I think a lot of us have been very distressed as we look at some of the coal production numbers and how, because of the war in Europe, that a lot of countries and a lot of utilities are turning back to coal because we just need the energy, and the consequences of not having energy are very, very severe. So there's kind of that harsh reality, and this is the world we live in, part of the argument. And the second part of the argument really is that we need to keep that industry engaged in being part of the solution instead of kind of marginalizing them so that they're living in a different world, and that their motivations become purely profit-oriented, and that they start fighting against the energy transition. So have I summarized that, reasonably enough?
Yes, those are the two key points.
So let's go and look at the first part of that equation. We've got the harsh reality of where we are, and you mentioned a bunch of different things, including plastics and asphalt and obviously heating and other things. Well, in fact, for that matter, methane is the largest source of hydrogen, which a lot of people think are part of the renewable economy. So there's green hydrogen, and then there's methane-derived hydrogen as well. So of those various different major use cases, some of them are more difficult to transition out of, right? So as well as some of them don't necessarily have the same environmental impact. You mentioned asphalt, which of course has a lot of oil content, but isn't the carbon still sequestered in asphalt? Or are we putting it in an atmosphere? Is that the same as burning it as a gallon of gasoline?
I don't think so, but I'm not really an expert on all these petroleum science. That's my co-authors.
Okay, so let's go to some of the other ones. So you talk about plastics in the book,
mm-hmm.
and there are alternatives to plastics. So,
yes,
or there's alternative sources of the materials that are manufactured plastics. Where are we on the curve of being able to use alternative means of creating plastics, and versus petroleum-based means of creating plastics? Where does the price curve intersect? When do we get to that? Replacements, or are petroleum plastics just a part of our future for as long as we can see out?
Unfortunately, yeah, fossil fuel plastics is so dominant right now. And I think the alternatives to plastics, the different feedstocks, are really kind of in the experimental and research stages. And so I think it will take quite a bit of effort to switch that around.
So that's one area, but there is research going on into alternative plastics. We already have some on the market. It's just a matter of there's costs involved. They're not competitive yet.
Yeah, and the scaling up. And there's the whole issue of how do you get enough of the feedstock and how do you scale it up? So, and this, one of the things that people talk about is greenwashing out there, right? But I think of it really just as a lot of different claims about climate and sustainability and what is really true. And sometimes what's really true is hard to call. Like, for example, with plastics. Okay, so you go to your local Whole Foods and you think, okay, this is a store that's dedicated to sustainability. And lo and behold, they sell bottled water in aluminum and steel and paper. And instead of plastic utensils, they have products made from, say, potato starch. And this is all better. And then these are biodegradable, compostable containers that we can use. And so this is great. This is the future. It's the alternative plastics. So the reality is that all those aluminum bottles and paper, steel, those take a lot more energy to produce than plastics.
But it seems to me that we may be conflating two different issues here. So there's the plastics problem is largely a problem of pollution, right? So plastic pollution in the market in the environment, and that's not necessarily a carbon issue. That's not an atmospheric pollution. That's a physical pollution in waterways. Yes. So it's a slightly separate question than the carbon question. And yes. I think that it's fair that aluminum and steel are more expensive to create in their first iteration. But my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is the reason that we're transitioning to some of those containers is that their recyclability is a much more compelling set of economics, and it's much easier to do, and it's much more of a realistic thing to do. So as a means of keeping plastics out of the ocean, out of landfills.
Yeah, and we definitely need to keep the plastics out of landfills and oceans. And actually, a lot of places are just outright banning all sorts of plastics, and for good reason, because it's just, there's no need to produce, a cheap shopping bag or a cheap fork for every takeout container or every takeout order at a restaurant. But the environmental impact of plastics is also very high in terms of carbon emissions already. And so for something else like steel or aluminum that has even higher emissions, a wholesale switch to those, plus the mining of those, the life cycle emissions costs is quite high. And the recyclability is an interesting argument because those are recycled a lot more. But that's also partly because a lot of what you use plastics for is exactly the cheapest and lowest use things that people don't necessarily recycle, So if, for example, all your water bottles started to be made from aluminum, will people recycle it in the same quantities as they do other types of aluminum products? And I don't know, I don't think we really know the answer. So it's just an example of, like, for any kind of climate claim, there's a lot of complexity and a lot of assumptions built into these models. And so I'm not here to confuse the issue. We absolutely need to reduce unnecessary plastic and recycle the rest and the whole chapter we did is a circular economy on it. But unfortunately, plastics on their own is not so easy to get rid of. In fact, we see that growing in use around the world.
Well, the underlying theme that you keep on kind of touching on, for me, it kind of comes back to what economists call externalities, right? You talk about what's the total impact of the mining and refinement and production and distribution of a particular, in this case, packaging material. And that if we have to start kind of looking at the bigger system questions in order to really evaluate the benefits or the impact of various different kinds of alternatives and develop policies and strategies. So this is one of the most important, one of the most interesting aspects of this whole discussion, at least for me, is where strategic goals like building a more sustainable planet run into capital and financing, right? And the ability to start building viable marketplaces that allow us to incorporate much more of the bigger picture, much more of these externalities, right? We see some jurisdictions putting carbon taxes on, for example, that are a means of incorporating the cost of carbon pollution into the price of the thing creating that pollution. And I think that is a very central tenet of the circular economy and of regenerative financing. So, and I think maybe the most obvious example of that would be the carbon credit marketplace that a lot of us have kind of heard about, and the idea that if we can start pricing these externalities in so that the goods and the companies that produce those goods that are creating a lot of the pollution, that some of the money going into those things is diverted to mitigation or sequestration or to alternatives to, subsidize their development so that we're not going to be incurring these, the damage of these externalities, forever. So can you help us understand kind of where we are with this idea that we can have marketplaces and tokens, credits that represent the pollution that these things cause and create incentives and disincentives in the marketplace?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, carbon markets are getting big and they're getting bigger as more and more countries are implementing the Paris Agreement and instituting some kind of a trading scheme. So we've had them in Europe. We now have several in the United States, the regional greenhouse gas initiatives kind of in the Northeast. California has different schemes like ranging from low carbon fuel standards for transportation to, California Air Resource Board has a lot of regulations. There's also a federal tax incentive for carbon capture here in the United States that was, I think, part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So, and also China just implemented a carbon market for its power generation sector a couple of years ago. So all these things are getting big, and something like over 1 billion people now live under some kind of a carbon trading regime somewhere in the world. So there's definitely that going on, and I think it will be important, actually. One of the frustrations in the oil and gas industry is actually the lack of clarity around all these carbon schemes. And many of them, I think, would feel more clear about how they're supposed to operate instead of just always having this thing hovering somewhere in the background. It's going to drop, but we don't know when and we don't know how much. And I think this is an interesting area because on one hand, it is an externality, right? It's an additional cost to the oil and gas industry, right, to now start having to think about this. But on the other hand, they definitely have ways to mitigate it and to earn carbon credits. They just need to make the investment into all these things. And so for the companies that make the investment, they could then have a competitive advantage if they could be under a sort of a fair carbon credit system, one that's not just lowest common denominator, cheap carbon offsets that you could buy. So it actually is to their advantage to enforce a more sort of strict carbon regulatory system. And I think this is what we're seeing is that for the companies in the industry that are making the investments to be more sustainable, they benefit from that as their competitive advantage, and they actually want or would benefit from stricter regulations and carbon markets so that they have that edge over other companies. So in some ways, the industry's goals and the environmental goals, they're very much aligned here in that if they're going to make the investment to reduce methane, to do carbon capture, they need to get paid back for it. And the way that works is through higher carbon prices, not lower.
So, there's a whole bunch of things that kind of come out of what you just said that I would like to unpack. But perhaps the very first one would be that, the overarching ethos here and attitude. So, you're painting a vision where oil and gas companies are motivated to be constructive and be part of the solution. And you've set up this argument that says if they can appreciate the regulatory landscape and understand the dynamics of the carbon marketplaces, and if they execute, a good strategy, that they can differentiate themselves competitively in the marketplace. That almost sounds like a bit of a stick way of approaching the problem from society and government standpoint. But what do you sense in working with oil and gas companies and talking to them? What's your sense of their attitude? Are they in denial about climate change, or are they absolutely this is an existential risk and we need to be a big part of the solution? What's the overarching attitude in the industry?
I think it's somewhere in between those 2 points that you have. And depending on the company, it actually varies. Okay, so I think the wholesale denial, I think that is rare, at least in public now. But how quickly they're moving towards a solution, that really varies. And what I think we need to see is more of a market reward for the companies that are making that transition, that are more proactive. And that's actually a key thing that's missing in the market right now, because there's still too much of the let's just throw them all out, let's divest fossil fuels, and let's just get rid of all of these. And a better dynamic would be one where the more proactive oil and gas companies have higher valuations, and that drags the whole industry along further in that direction.
Yeah. And of course, valuation has traditionally been associated with revenue and profitability. And you're suggesting that we need to either figure out how people value some of the non-financial attributes. And I think that there is some of that going on with a lot of the ESG-oriented investing community, that people are starting to ascribe other value besides profit and revenue. But ultimately, that's still obviously a very important driver. So then we get to the second part of the question I wanted to unpack, which was about creating the market dynamic, the incentive structure that aligns the objectives of all of us that all of us have in sustainability with the strategies that these oil and gas companies are executing. Now, we've had carbon trading marketplaces for quite a while. And, you mentioned the term greenwashing a little while ago, and there's lots of companies that wrap themselves, in the flag of sustainability. And there's a fair amount of probably healthy skepticism that a lot of those claims have a lot of merit. And frankly, that the carbon trading marketplace, is auditable, right? Has any real fundamental credibility, is any more than a public relations exercise. So what's your sense on, where we are with kind of integrity in that marketplace?
Yeah, I think this is a tough question in that there's compliance carbon government run markets, and there's the voluntary carbon markets where people can register a project, like we reduced emissions by planting trees or by changing some process at our company or something, and then we want to sell some carbon offsets to another company. So they both have their own issues. Okay, like the government run credit system, like in the EU, for many years was over allocated. Many legacy industries just got tons and tons of credits without having to do anything. So the value per ton of carbon became very, very low. I think we're finally getting past that. They're phasing those out. But government accounting schemes for emissions are often pretty simplistic and could be erroneous. On the other hand, the voluntary carbon market, I think their problem is basically that they're set up to do what I think is impossible, which is prove a counterfactual, right? If I weren't born, what would have happened to everybody I know? Kind of a question.
Well, yeah, that's the group. Well, there's a group in there that drives me a little crazy, and I kind of think of them as the extortion group that, give me a carbon credit or I will cut down this swath of rainforest, right? Give me a carbon credit or I will develop these potential oil fields in Greenland. And, if you give me carbon credits, then I promise I won't develop them, right? So it seems to me that there's a class of these things that seems a little unsavory, which suggests to me that there's a continuum, that there is a range of quality of carbon credit, right? I mean, if I put a carbon scrubber or if I actually sequester atmospheric carbon, right? Or even if I could even see the case for electric vehicles, for example, that, demonstrably are, taking gas off of the highways because we're displacing internal combustion engines. So I can see a lot of those cases, but it does seem to me that there is a bit of a continuum, right? That there's a range of quality of these carbon credits. How do we sort all that out?
Well, at this point, the government-run compliance markets are so much bigger than the voluntary markets that really that's the one that matters. Okay, we're talking about $1 trillion plus market that's growing very quickly as more countries institute carbon trading versus a voluntary market that's about $1 billion a year, which is really that's less than, the market for chapstick, for example, So in the compliance carbon markets, I think there just needs to be more sort of responsible looking at where these markets are and where they need to head to. Because a lot of times people they go and, they try to get governments to pass various forms of legislation. And then they pat themselves on the back. Look, we finally passed a law that requires all these big, bad polluting companies to do something. And then when you actually go and read the law and how the reporting is done and who's excluded, there's a lot of holes in those, okay? And then a lot of the methodologies are quite outdated. That's one of the things we found researching for our book. So what group is going to be consistently there looking at these companies and saying, where do they need to go? And I think the group for doing that is actually the investment community. Because, I'm talking as a former fund manager, right? But that's what we did all day. We studied things. We thought about where they would go. We made projections. We looked at data. And that's our job. That's what we're trained to do. And so the investment community needs to be really much more connected to those markets and thinking about how they would affect the companies that they invest in. And then they could sort of push things in the right direction, if you will.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. Ultimately, how attractive a value proposition is to a class of investors drives the strategy of that organization. And I see more and more activist investors and institutional investors that have as a matter of core policy that things have to be, ESG compliant or have to behave in a certain kind of way that it's constructive to the environment. So I do see that as being a very big pressure. And I've seen some big oil companies that have had to make significant alterations in their strategies because investors have come in and said, no, we're not going to go in that direction. We're going to go in this direction. And ultimately, investors own the company. So I've seen that, but it kind of still has me circling around to the viability of these marketplaces, and which begs the question, a lot of the work you're doing, the title of your book involves blockchain. So how does Web3 and blockchain make a difference? What has the introduction of that technology done to the carbon marketplace, and how do you see it evolving?
Yeah, I think so far it is still in the early stages, but we're seeing a lot of different potential applications, and some of them are happening. For example, a lot of these oil and gas and energy production processes are very complicated. So people are using the blockchain to track the provenance of their feedstock, how different products are produced, how the carbon capture is actually happening, and how much is stored, and all the different production processes. And what we envision it going from there is attaching certificates of origin, certificates of climate attributes to products, so that oil and gas becomes more of a digital asset as much as it is today a physical product that you ship, right? But that people are buying oil and gas because of their environmental attributes. And then other applications, for example, is really tracking all the different climate claims so that all the different carbon markets are in sync with each other, and a company is not monetizing the carbon reduction multiple times in different carbon markets. And I think that will become a very important application for the blockchain as well.
Yeah, we kind of look at this as Web3 as being a grouping of complementary and force multiplying technologies, including blockchain, artificial intelligence, IoT, and spatial UX, AR, VR stuff. Yeah, I can see the idea that IoT helps us do high quality measurements, and that if you can ledger those measurements, and once data is on the ledger, if the ledger is immutable and distributed, then you've got a high quality data set that you can then use as a basis for authoritatively or confidently trading. So that becomes a big part of it. And I also suspect that artificial intelligence may give us a lens to detect fraud or detect exaggeration, right? That we can kind of look at patterns, that the combination of these technologies has some potential to give us confidence that when we're buying and selling a carbon credit, that credit represents an actual measurement somewhere, that as that unit that it's measuring has moved through supply chains and refinement and distribution and all that kind of stuff, that it has been added to or subtracted to depending on what interactions it has with the rest of the system, and that there is digital scarcity, right? That we're not doing counterfeiting and double counting, that it is what it is. So I'm personally hopeful that those marketplaces will get a lot more credibility because we can deploy these technologies in support of them. Do you buy that?
Yeah, I think that would be a very important part of it. Just having this whole certificate of origin and basically being able to trace the environmental attributes of products so that we know that what we're buying is real and that, it's not causing some other offsetting or negative influence on the other side. And also that it's not being sold in different markets over and over again. The country isn't claiming an emissions reduction, and then the company isn't claiming an emissions reduction, and then its customers are claiming it again. And
well, that's a variation on the double spending problem, right? The double claiming problem. It's basically the same fundamental data problem.
Exactly.
Now, there's an interesting derivative or variation on this theme that I've been kind of watching and trying to get my head around, and that's the book and claim system, right? Mm-hmm. So there are various different airlines, just use aviation fuel, you mentioned it before, use that as an example, that for either public relations reasons or because of customer demand or investor demand, or because they actually sincerely believe that we need to move to this, they want to incorporate more and more sustainable aviation fuel, alternative aviation fuel into the mix. But of course, the reality is that they go and land in some airport that doesn't have the facilities or the storage or those alternative fuel sources available. And so all they can do is put regular jet fuel into the plane. But through a book and claim system, they can claim the credit for using alternative fuel because someone else used alternative fuel but didn't register it or paid the basic rate for the traditional fuel. So while in actuality, in the physical world, those planes aren't carrying sustainable aviation fuel, in the virtual digital world, from a systems point of view, they actually are. So do you see these kinds of book and claim systems? It's almost like a digital twinning. And once you've done a digital twin of something, you can start to do all kinds of fancy things about trading and moving credits around very, very efficiently. Do you see this really, taking hold and becoming a big thing, or even a bigger thing than just aviation fuel?
Yeah, actually, we do. We see that happening. Plastics. People are creating sustainable plastic credits, recycled plastic credits. So that's one of them. People are trying to create certificates for low emission natural gas. So there's something called responsibly sourced gas that people get certified that their natural gas has lower methane emissions, and obviously carbon capture and storage, right? That's a big one. It's a fundamental part of carbon markets. So I think this will become a standard feature in much of the energy sector, just like renewable energy certificates are today for solar and wind.
So do you see a path forward for a strategy that is environmentally and financially sustainable as a business model for oil and gas companies?
Yes, I do, actually. And perversely, it's one of the things that helps them is the presence of renewable energy being this very low cost source of energy, but is currently not available everywhere at all times. So already in California, actually, the cheapest time to use energy should be about 2:00 in the afternoon, right? When all our solar panels are at full power. And then at 7:00 or 8:00, it should be much more expensive. So as oil and gas transitions from, the only fuel source where everybody's just, by the way, part of the problem for them is everybody leans on them to produce lower cost energy all over the world, right? So, but as their alternatives, they can start to transition oil and natural gas as kind of a premium fuel with attributes that, say, renewable energy doesn't have. They can also benefit from these environmental regulations that demand lower emissions. So, okay, they could invest in carbon capture, they could invest in these processes, and then charge for it and get paid back for it. So the oil and gas industry will probably be smaller because they won't be the only energy source that we'll rely on. I mean, that has to be true, right? We just invented nuclear fusion last year. But during a very long transition period, while it's still used, they could benefit actually from a lot of the environmental attributes that's required of energy in general going forward. So the two actually, I think of that as the path going forward to them, where, yes, they can produce the fuel for you and they can charge you to capture the carbon emissions for you.
Your book seems to, in part, be a call to action. Point out that oil and gas companies have an important role to play and have an opportunity. They have some incredibly smart people. They have a good awareness of the international global regulatory landscape. They have a lot of working capital. They've got significant brand recognition and brand power in the marketplace and various other advantages of incumbency. So in many ways, as we move into this energy transition era, you would think that they have a lot of considerable advantages to be part of not only solving the very real problems we have, but being a vital, important part of the new energy economy as it emerges. And to your point, I think you're just making, that this isn't today it's one way and tomorrow it's another way. This will be a transition that will, span a very long period of time, and we're actually already into that transition. So what if you were talking to the CEO, the management, board of directors of a big energy company, and they were asking you what's kind of what are the most important strategic things we should be looking at going forward? What would your top few pieces of advice be to them?
Yeah, my advice would be to recognize that the energy transition is real and to get ahead of the game as much as possible. Okay. And once you're the leader, convince your investors that you're going to be successful in this so that you command a higher multiple of earnings, multiple of assets relative to the rest of the industry. And from there, you're in a good position, right? You can acquire the other companies. You can do a lot of things to grow. And the industry will probably get smaller, but there's definitely room at the top for somebody who runs it well through this energy transition. And it could be a very successful transition, both from a climate perspective and from a business perspective.
Okay, finally, we've talked about energy companies, big oil and gas companies, and for a lot of us, they're kind of remote, the arm's length sort of constructs that are a little hard for us to grasp and get our heads around. And yet, I think a lot of us are starting to feel the impact of climate change directly, right? On the East Coast, we've just endured a week of some of the worst air quality that we've ever experienced. You've probably seen some of the pictures coming out of New York City.
Sure.
They're just extraordinary. And it seems that we're going to see more and more of this sort of disruption that's going to cause death and disease and discomfort. So what do you think we can do as individuals, right? And I suppose it's a broad landscape. It's not just consumption or even our demand response, but also how we decide to make consumer decisions or who we decide to invest in. What is a call to action for, all of us?
Sure. I think, for each of us, there's probably a different role, and everybody could do something, right, to help reduce the climate impact and emissions. And for me, it's looking at the investment side of energy and major industries. For somebody else, it could be like just changing the behavior of people and being more sustainable. But really if it is something you want to do, really try to understand it and then try to understand why it's not happening. Like whatever it is that you might think, okay, let's insulate our house better, right? Reduce energy, get paid back. Then really go out there and talk to people and see why they don't do it, and see if there's problems out there that you could solve. And what I'm seeing is a lot of times industries, it's not just a group of greedy men sitting somewhere wanting to destroy the planet. Okay, the industries that I've looked at, they have structural problems. They can't solve the problem as quickly as we like. So try to solve some of those problems. And I think that's what we could really do. Try to understand why people can't do the things that they should and see if you could help them fix that.
Thank you so much for that. I agree that a lot of this has to do with attitude and, kind of thinking through this landscape without our natural temptation to cast villains and heroes and appreciate that it's actually a very complex landscape and that we're transitioning from one world to another world, and it doesn't happen overnight. And we have to put the right incentives and disincentives in place. And we also should hope that the people that are running these companies are motivated by the right kinds of things in service to the public good. So I'm hopeful. I think we have a lot of challenges ahead of ourselves. But thank you so much for your particular contribution to this this dialogue and enriching the ideascape, because we need to think through these things and get a framework on how to think through the problem and how to design solutions. Thank you so much, Si, for joining us today and helping us better understand sustainability in the oil and gas industry. And thank you all for joining us today for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find out more information about this topic by visiting sustainableoilgas.com. You can also order sustainable oil and gas using blockchain at that website, or you can also get it on Amazon. You can find out more information about blockchain in the oil and gas industry, including a paper that I authored, as well as research on many other topics at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. I'd also invite you to subscribe to our newsletter. I'm your host, Doug Heintzman, and we hope that you'll join us for our next episode of W3B Talks.